The phone rang at 2:47 in the afternoon, and I remember that number exactly, because I would spend the rest of my life dividing time into before that call and after it. My name is James. I was standing in the break room at Halloran Logistics, stirring sugar into coffee I didn't even want, when my cell buzzed against the counter with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I wish, some nights, that I had. Not because it would have changed anything, but because for 3 more seconds I would have still been a man who believed his life was simple. Is this James Whitfield? Father of Eli Whitfield. The voice was calm in the specific way that trained people are calm when they're about to say something that will not let you stay calm. I said yes. I said, it's me. Is everything okay? And there was a pause on the other end that I have never forgotten. A pause that felt 3 times too long. And then the officer told me that my son had been found alone in a locked vehicle in the parking lot of a place called Brannigan's on Route 9, that he was safe now, that he was scared but physically fine, and that my wife was currently being questioned. I don't remember hanging up. I remember being in my car with my hands on the wheel and not remembering how I'd gotten there. I was 34 years old. I'd been married to Taylor for 7 years, together for 9, and up until that Tuesday afternoon I would have told you, without hesitation, that I knew exactly who my wife was. I worked in logistics, routes, schedules, contingencies, the quiet satisfaction of things arriving where they were supposed to arrive, when they were supposed to arrive. I like to think I applied that same instinct to my marriage. I trusted the schedule. I trusted that Taylor, when she said she was working late, was working late. Eli was 5. He had my mother's stubborn chin and Taylor's quick laugh. And that week he'd been obsessed with a plastic dinosaur missing one leg that he refused to leave the house without. When I finally reached the scene, after driving faster than I've ever driven in my life, after running 2 red lights I don't remember running, the first thing I saw was Eli wrapped in a silver emergency blanket, sitting in the back of an ambulance with a paramedic crouched in front of him, and he was holding that one-legged dinosaur so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Daddy," he said, and that was the whole world collapsing into one syllable. I don't know how long I held him. I know a police officer eventually had to touch my shoulder to get my attention, and I know that when I finally looked past him toward the squad car parked at an angle across 2 spaces, I saw Taylor in the back seat, not handcuffed. I want to be clear about that, because for weeks afterward people would ask, as if the presence or absence of handcuffs changed what she'd done, but sitting very still, staring straight ahead, her makeup smeared down one cheek in 2 clean lines. She looked at me through the window. I have replayed that look more times than I can count, trying to read it. Shame, I think. But something else underneath the shame, something I couldn't name yet, something that looked almost like relief. The specific relief of a person who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has finally, catastrophically, set it down. It would be 9 more days before I understood what that look actually meant. That afternoon, all I knew was what the officer told me in the parking lot. In the flat procedural voice, they must train for exactly this kind of conversation. My wife had left our son in the car, windows up, engine off, for what the dashcam timestamps and a security camera from the strip mall would later confirm was 2 hours and 41 minutes, on a 91-degree day, while she went inside a building 3 doors down from Brannigan's, a building that housed, among other businesses, a private office suite rented out by the hour to independent consultants. She'd told the responding officers she'd only been gone a few minutes. The timestamps said otherwise. A passerby, an older man walking his dog, had noticed Eli through the window, noticed he was crying, noticed the stillness of a car that had clearly been sitting too long, and called it in himself. That man's name was Gerald Voss, and though he would never know it, he became, without meaning to, the reason my son is alive to remember any of this at all. I want to stop here for a second, because there's a specific detail from that day that I still can't set down. Eli's dinosaur had lost its second leg by the time I got him home, snapped off from how tightly he'd been gripping it in the heat, in the fear, in whatever 2 hours and 41 minutes feels like to a 5-year-old who doesn't yet understand why the world has stopped making sense. I superglued it back on that night at 11 o'clock, sitting alone at the kitchen table, because it felt like the only thing in my life I still knew how to fix. Taylor and I had been ordinary before that Tuesday. Not perfect. I'll say now what I couldn't have said then, that I'd noticed things over the past several months, the later hours at the marketing firm where she worked, The way she'd started angling her phone screen away from me on the couch. The new perfume that showed up in the bathroom cabinet with no explanation. I'd noticed. I'd filed it under stress, under a demanding boss, under the ordinary erosions of a marriage 7 years deep. I told myself a story where all of it made sense, because the alternative story was one I didn't want to read. That night, after the hospital cleared Eli and sent us home with instructions to watch for signs of heat exhaustion that never came, I sat on the edge of our bed while Taylor showered for what felt like a very long time. I could hear the water running, and I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, she's not washing off the day. She's washing off something specific. I didn't know yet what that something was. I didn't know about Nathan Brooks, or the 6 months that preceded that Tuesday, or the office suite 3 doors down from Brannigan's that had nothing to do with independent consulting and everything to do with the reason my son had been left alone in a hot car while his mother decided, for 2 hours and 41 minutes, that some other need mattered more than his safety. I only knew that when Taylor finally came out of the bathroom, wrapped in her robe, her eyes red and raw, and said the words, "James, I need to tell you something." I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, the way water goes right before it freezes. I had no idea, sitting there, that the story she was about to start telling me wouldn't actually finish for another 9 days, and that the version she gave me that night was only the first of several versions, each one peeling back to reveal something worse underneath. I need to tell you something turned out to mean almost nothing that first night. Taylor sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd glued Eli's dinosaur back together a few hours earlier, and told me that she'd stepped out to grab coffee from the place next to Brannigan's, that she'd run into a coworker, that time had gotten away from her, that she was so sorry, that she would never forgive herself. She cried in a way that seemed real. I believed almost all of it, because believing it was easier than the alternative, and because I still didn't have a single fact that contradicted her. I want to go back further than that Tuesday, though, because the truth is the story didn't start with a locked car. It started months earlier, in small pieces I collected without knowing I was collecting them. Taylor worked as a marketing coordinator at a firm called Ridgeline Creative, a 20-minute drive from our house in Maple Grove. She'd been there 4 years, long enough to know everyone, long enough that when she mentioned names at dinner, Priya from the design team, her boss Denise, a new account manager named Nathan who'd apparently transferred in from the Columbus office, I absorbed them the way you absorb the furniture of someone else's daily life. Present, familiar, unremarkable. The late night started, as far as I can pin down, around February. Not dramatic at first. An extra hour here and there. An email she'd stay up answering after Eli went to bed. A mention of a big client pitch that had the whole team living at the office. I didn't think anything of it. I'd had stretches like that myself. Entire quarters at Halloran where I barely saw my own dinner table before 8. By April, the extra hour had become 2 or 3, several nights a week. I noticed, I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as if I were blind, and I wasn't blind, I was something worse. I was a man who noticed and chose not to look directly at what he was noticing. Here's one thing I noticed and dismissed. Taylor started keeping her phone face down. Always had, actually, since I'd known her. She said it was a habit from a job before Ridgeline, something about not wanting notifications visible during meetings. But sometime in the spring, the habit changed texture. She started angling it away from me specifically, not just laying it flat. Once, on the couch, my hand brushed it reaching for the remote, and she picked it up so fast I actually flinched. "Sorry," she said, laughing a little too quickly. "Reflex." I laughed too. I didn't ask what the reflex was protecting. Here's another thing. Perfume. Taylor had worn the same drugstore vanilla and amber scent since college. A bottle that lived on the same corner of the bathroom counter for as long as we'd been married. In March, a new bottle appeared. Something sharper, more expensive looking, a name I didn't recognize on the label. When I asked about it, she said Priya had recommended it, that she'd wanted to change. People change their perfume. I told myself that. I told myself a lot of things that spring. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever stood in a room full of people you love and still felt a specific, quiet distance settling in, like weather moving in from somewhere you can't see yet, you already know what that spring felt like from the inside. I didn't have a name for it. I just knew that Taylor, who used to tell me everything, even the boring parts of her day, had started giving me summaries instead of stories. And I told myself that's just what happens after 7 years. I told myself the summaries were normal. Eli, meanwhile, had started kindergarten that January, and most of my attention that spring genuinely was there. School drop-offs, a rough patch where he didn't want to go, a teacher conference about his trouble sitting still. He was the center of gravity in our house. And in hindsight, I think Taylor and I had both quietly agreed, without ever discussing it, to let him be the center of gravity, because it meant neither of us had to look too hard at the space between us. There was a night in late April I still think about. Taylor came home near 10, later than she'd said, and when she leaned down to kiss Eli goodnight, he'd fallen asleep on the couch waiting for her. She stayed crouched there for a long moment, just looking at him, and when she stood up her eyes were wet. I asked if she was okay. She said she was just tired. I remember thinking it was sweet, a little strange, but sweet. A mother overwhelmed by love for her sleeping child. I didn't consider, not for a second, that what I was looking at might have been guilt wearing the face of tenderness. By May, the pattern had a shape to it, if I'd been willing to trace the shape. Late nights clustering around Tuesdays and Thursdays. A gym membership that appeared on our shared bank statement that she said was for stress relief, at a gym I never once saw her leave for. A weekend girls' trip to Cincinnati with Priya and 2 other women from work, the first overnight trip she'd taken without me or Eli in 3 years. I drove her to the airport for that one. I remember thinking, in the parking garage, how strange it was that I felt a small flicker of relief watching her walk toward the terminal. Not suspicion, just a tired man's relief at an empty house for 2 nights. I didn't examine that feeling either. I had a lot of feelings that spring I chose not to examine. She called twice during that trip. Both calls were short. Both times, in the background, I heard what sounded like a hotel hallway, the particular echoing hush of carpeted corridors, rather than anything that sounded like Cincinnati traffic or a hotel bar full of her coworkers. I noticed that too. I told myself hotels all sound the same. The trip that actually mattered, though, the one I'd trace everything back to, once I finally had the full picture, wasn't the Cincinnati weekend. It was a Thursday in early June, 3 days before the incident in the parking lot, when Taylor came home from work distracted in a way I'd never seen her distracted before. She burned dinner. She snapped at Eli over something trivial, then apologized so extravagantly it embarrassed him. And later that night, lying next to me in bed, staring at the ceiling, she said, out of nowhere, "Do you ever think we got married too young?" I laughed it off, told her we were 25 and 27, hardly children. She didn't laugh with me. She just said, "No, I know. Never mind," and rolled onto her side. And I lay there in the dark next to a woman I thought I knew completely, feeling a small cold draft come through a window I didn't yet know was open. I didn't think about that conversation again until 3 days later, standing in a hospital parking lot with my son wrapped in a silver blanket. I should have. Looking back now, I think the week after that Thursday night conversation was the week everything sped up, as if Taylor knew something was accelerating past the point where she could steer it, even if I didn't know it yet. It started with the phone call from Denise, her boss, on the Monday. I only found out about the call later, but it matters here, because it's one of the threads that eventually pulled taut. Denise called Taylor into her office to talk about a discrepancy on a client expense report, a hotel charge from the Cincinnati trip that didn't match the room count for the 4 women who'd supposedly shared 2 rooms. Taylor explained it away as a booking error. Denise let it go. But Denise mentioned it, in passing, to Priya. And Priya, who actually had shared a room with Taylor that weekend, for exactly 1 night, before Taylor said she wanted to get some air and didn't come back until morning. Went quiet in a way that would matter enormously 9 days later, when Priya became the person who finally told me the truth she'd been sitting on. I didn't know any of that yet. What I knew, that week, was smaller and stranger. On Tuesday, I picked up Taylor's phone by accident. Mine had died, and hers was charging on the counter, and I grabbed it out of habit to check the time. The screen lit up with a text preview before I could stop myself from reading it. "Can't tonight. He has a thing after school, TMRW?" No name attached, just a contact saved as N. Ridgeline, and no further context. I remember standing there in the kitchen, thumb hovering over the screen, feeling a specific kind of vertigo, the sense that I was one tap away from either nothing at all or something I couldn't take back. I put the phone down. I told myself it was a coworker, a project, an initial that could belong to a dozen people. If I had opened that thread that afternoon instead of 2 weeks later, everything that follows would have gone very differently. Instead, I did what I'd been doing all spring. I filed it away. I told myself a story where the initial N stood for nothing, where the tension in our house was ordinary marriage weather, where my wife, the woman who'd stayed up with me through 2 miscarriages before Eli, who'd driven 4 hours through a snowstorm to be at my father's bedside, who I had never once caught in a real lie in 9 years, was not capable of becoming a stranger. That week, Eli's kindergarten had its spring program, and Taylor almost missed it. She arrived 11 minutes late, slipping into the folding chair beside me just as the kids filed on stage, her cheeks flushed, her breath a little short, mouthing sorry, traffic without quite meeting my eyes. Eli spotted her from the risers, and his whole face lit up the way it only did for her, and watching that, I remember thinking, whatever's going on with her, it isn't about not loving us. I didn't yet understand that a person can love her family completely and still be somewhere else entirely, in her head, in her body, in the hours she's supposed to be giving to them. There's a moment from that same week I want to set down carefully, because I only understood its shape afterward. Taylor's sister, Renee, called our house on a Wednesday evening, a call I answered because Taylor was in the shower. Renee and Taylor had always been close, the kind of sisters who spoke 3 times a week about nothing in particular, and Renee asked, casually, chattily, if Taylor's thing was going okay. I asked what thing. There was a pause on the line, the specific pause of someone realizing they've said something they weren't supposed to say, and Renee recovered fast. Oh, just a work stress thing. She mentioned she was overwhelmed, but the recovery came a half-second too late, and I heard it. I didn't push. I told Taylor her sister called. Taylor's face did something complicated for just a moment before she smiled and said she'd call Renee back. I didn't think much of it that night. It sat in me anyway, a small hard stone I kept turning over without meaning to. The behavioral shifts kept sharpening that week in ways I can only really see clearly now, laid end to end. Taylor started sleeping badly. I'd wake at 2 or 3 in the morning to find her side of the bed empty, and once found her sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, not doing anything, just sitting, her phone face down in front of her like something she was guarding. When I asked if she was okay, she said she couldn't turn her brain off, work stress, and came back to bed, but she lay there rigid, not sleeping, for a long time after. She'd also started over-explaining things that didn't need explaining, where she'd parked, why a receipt was in her purse from a lunch place across town, why she'd needed to stop for gas twice in one day. Small things. Things a person only explains when they're rehearsing an explanation for something bigger, though I didn't understand that grammar yet. I noticed the over-explaining and thought, generously, that she was just stressed and trying to be considerate. I filed it, like everything else, under stress. She told me, much later, what was actually happening on her end that week. A version of events I only heard 9 days after the parking lot, sitting across from her in a lawyer's conference room. Though I've placed it here because it belongs here, in the timeline of what was actually true underneath what I could see. I knew it was getting reckless. I knew the lie about Cincinnati wasn't going to hold once Denise started asking about the room charges, and I lay awake those nights not because of work, but because I kept running the numbers on how much longer I could keep 2 entire lives running on parallel tracks without them colliding. I told myself I'd end it after the summer. I told myself that every week I found a reason it had to be one more week. I wasn't thinking about James in those nights. I want that to be honest. I was thinking about not getting caught, which is its own kind of shame I didn't let myself look at directly. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. That week, all I had was a stone in my stomach and a habit of putting it down every time it got too heavy to hold. By Thursday of that week, 2 days before the parking lot, Taylor told me she had a work trip scheduled for the following Tuesday, an overnight in Columbus for a vendor summit. I said that was fine. I remember, distinctly, not asking a single follow-up question, because some part of me had started to understand that the fewer questions I asked, the fewer answers I'd have to sit with. That Friday night, Eli asked me, completely out of nowhere, while I was tucking him in, "Why does mommy smell different now?" I told him grown-ups sometimes change their perfume. "Buddy, go to sleep." He accepted that the way 5-year-olds accept most things adults tell them. Instantly, completely, because the alternative, That the adults around him might not have the answers either was not yet a thought he was equipped to have. I lay awake a long time that night myself, turning that stone over one more time. 3 days later, I would understand that my son had noticed, with a child's honest and undefended senses, something I had spent months carefully arranging myself not to see. The Saturday before the parking lot, I did something I'd never done in 9 years with Taylor. I went looking. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't a single dramatic suspicion that finally broke through. It was the accumulated weight of small things, the initial N on the phone screen, Renee's half-second pause, the new perfume, the sleepless nights at the kitchen table. Taken alone, none of it proved anything. Taken together, it had started to feel less like static and more like a signal, and some part of me, the part that spent all day at work solving problems by tracing where a shipment had actually gone instead of where the paperwork said it should be, finally turned that same instinct on my own house. Taylor had taken Eli to her mother's for the afternoon. I sat alone in our bedroom with her laptop, which she'd left charging on the dresser, and I told myself I was just going to check our shared calendar for the Columbus trip details. That was the lie I told myself to get the lid open. Once it was open, I didn't stop at the calendar. I found the credit card statement first, not hidden, just sitting in an email from the bank, a joint account I'd honestly forgotten we still used for smaller purchases. A charge from 6 weeks earlier at a hotel 40 minutes from Ridgeline Creative, dated to a Thursday, she'd told me was a late night at the office. Amount, $187. I stared at that number for a long time. It felt smaller and larger than I expected, both at once. Then I found the gym membership, the one I'd noticed on our statement back in April, the one she said was for stress relief. I looked up the address. It was a 24-hour fitness chain, but the specific location was 2 doors down from the same private office suite building on Route 9, 3 doors from Brannigan's, where Eli would be found alone 3 days later. I didn't understand the significance of that yet. I only understood that a gym she said she went to for stress relief was located next to a building that had nothing to do with fitness at all. I want to stop here for a second, because I think this is the moment that actually mattered most in that whole search, more than any single receipt. I sat on the edge of our bed with her laptop still glowing in front of me, and I felt something that wasn't yet fully suspicion and wasn't yet fully grief. It was the specific, disorienting vertigo of realizing that the woman sleeping beside me every night had an entire second geography I knew nothing about. Streets, addresses, hours that existed in parallel to the map I thought we shared. I didn't find a name that day. I found shapes, a hotel, a gym membership that made no sense, a pattern of late nights that clustered around specific days of the week. I closed the laptop before Taylor got home, and I sat with what I'd found for 2 full days without saying a word to her, because I didn't yet have anything I could point to and say this, explain this, and some old, stubborn part of me still wanted to be wrong. That Sunday, I called my brother, Marcus. Marcus had gone through his own divorce 4 years earlier, and he was the only person I trusted enough to say the actual words out loud. I think Taylor might be seeing someone. He didn't tell me I was crazy. He didn't tell me I was right, either. He just asked one question that I've never forgotten. What does your gut say? Not your evidence, your gut. And I told him the truth, which was that my gut had known for weeks and my mind had been the one making excuses. Marcus told me not to confront her yet. Get more than a feeling, he said. Get something undeniable, because a woman who's good at hiding something will talk her way around a feeling every time. I didn't love that advice, but I took it. Monday, the day before her Columbus trip, I did something that still sits uneasily with me, even now, even knowing everything I know. I looked through the browser history on the family laptop, the one Eli sometimes used for his reading app, the one that synced to Taylor's account. Most of it was nothing. Work emails, a recipe site, an article about kindergarten sleep regressions. But there was one search, from 2 weeks earlier, that stopped me cold. How to tell if your husband suspects. I sat with that phrase a long time. Not am I doing the right thing. Not how do I stop this. How to tell if your husband suspects. It told me, more clearly than any receipt could have, that whatever was happening wasn't a mistake she'd stumbled into and didn't know how to name. It was something she was actively managing, the way you manage a project with a deadline and a risk of exposure. I didn't think about that search again until 3 days later, standing in a hospital parking lot, finally understanding exactly what she'd been managing and how badly the timeline had slipped out from under her. Tuesday morning, Taylor left for her vendor summit in Columbus with an overnight bag and a kiss on Eli's forehead that lasted just slightly too long. I drove her to work instead of letting her take her own car. I told her mine needed gas near her office anyway, which was true, but wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that I wanted to see, with my own eyes, whether a car from Ridgeline Creative's lot was actually headed toward Columbus or somewhere else entirely. I watched her walk into the building. I told myself that was enough, that I'd done my due diligence, that a person can only chase a feeling so far before it curdles into something uglier than the truth itself. I went to work. I answered emails. I picked up Eli from school that afternoon because Taylor was supposedly still in Columbus, and it was an entirely ordinary Tuesday evening. Homework and dinner and a bath and a bedtime story about a dinosaur with one leg glued back on. And I told myself, lying in bed alone that night, that maybe I was building a case against an innocent woman out of nothing but stress and my own insecurity. She came home Wednesday evening, tired, a little quiet, and told me the summit had gone well. I asked, careful and light, what hotel they'd put her up in. She named one. I didn't say anything else. I didn't tell her about the credit card statement, the gym address, the search history, the initial N still sitting unexamined in her phone. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. The right moment came for me anyway, without my choosing it, the very next afternoon. A Thursday, the day I would later learn Taylor had told her office she was taking Eli to a pediatrician appointment, and had instead picked him up from school early, driven him to a parking lot on Route 9, and left him in the car with the windows up while she walked into a building 3 doors down from a restaurant called Brannigan's. I had spent 5 days gathering fragments of a story I didn't yet have the courage to read as a whole. 3 days later, the whole story would be handed to me by a police officer's voice on the phone, and every fragment I'd been holding onto would suddenly click into a shape I could no longer look away from. 9 days after the parking lot, I finally had all of it. Not fragments anymore, but the whole shape, handed to me in pieces by people who had run out of reasons to protect Taylor's version of events. The first piece came from Priya at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Ridgeline Creative on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd asked to meet me, which surprised me. Taylor and I had barely spoken since the incident, communicating mostly through clipped, careful sentences about Eli's schedule and the criminal attorney Taylor had hired. Priya sat across from me with her hands wrapped around a cup she never drank from, and she told me about the Cincinnati trip, the one night she'd actually shared a room with Taylor before Taylor said she needed air and didn't come back until 6 in the morning. She told me she'd suspected for months that she'd seen Taylor and a coworker named Nathan Brooks leave the building together more times than made sense for 2 people who supposedly just worked on adjacent accounts. She said she was sorry she hadn't said anything sooner. I believed her. I didn't blame her. I understood, by then, exactly how easy it is to see a shape and still refuse to call it what it is. The second piece came from the detective assigned to Eli's case, who informed me, carefully, procedurally, that Nathan Brooks had been interviewed, that Brooks had confirmed an ongoing relationship with Taylor spanning approximately 6 months, and that Brooks's own wife had been notified as part of the investigation scope. I learned, later, that she filed for divorce within the week. I confronted Taylor that Thursday evening, in the kitchen of a house I already knew, somewhere underneath the numbness. I would not be living in with her much longer. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect a scene like this to be loud, and mine wasn't. I laid it out instead, item by item. The way I'd trace a shipment that had gone missing, the hotel charge, the gym membership 2 doors from Brannigan's, the search history, Priya's account of Cincinnati, the detective's confirmation of Nathan Brooks's name. Here is what I know, I told her. Here is what doesn't add up. I want you to explain it to me. All of it. Not the version you gave the police. Not the version you gave me 9 days ago. The truth. Taylor didn't deny anything. That surprised me more than the affair itself. Somehow, that when the moment finally came, she didn't reach for one more edited version. She sat down across from me at the table, and she started crying before she'd said a single full sentence, and she grabbed for my hand across the table, and when I pulled it back she flinched like I'd struck her. I'm not going to try to make this sound better than it is, she said, her voice breaking apart on almost every word. I know I don't get to ask you to understand. I I need you to know I never meant for it to become what it became. Please, James. Please don't leave. I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. I'll tell you everything. I'll never see him again. I swear to God. Just, please don't take Eli from me. Please. She said please so many times that evening it stopped sounding like a word and started sounding like something closer to a wound. She reached for my hand again. I let her take it that time, not because I'd forgiven anything, but because some old reflex in me still couldn't watch her fall apart without responding to it. And I hated myself a little for that reflex, and I hated her more for still being able to trigger it. I asked her the only question that mattered that night. How long? 6 months, she said. It started in December. At the holiday party. Her voice had gone very small. James, I can't do this the way you want me to right now. I can't lay it all out calmly like you're doing. I don't have it in me tonight. I will tell you everything. I promise you I will, but I can't do it like this, not with you looking at me like that. I let her have that. I want to say it was mercy, but honestly it was closer to exhaustion. I didn't have it in me either, that night, to hear the whole thing in one sitting. I told her we'd talk again, properly, and that until then, Eli would be staying with my mother. I didn't know it yet, but the version of the truth Taylor would eventually give me, the real one, in full, wouldn't come for another 4 days, and it would be worse, in specific ways, than anything I'd pieced together on my own. The custody hearing came first, faster than I expected. The state's case against Taylor for child endangerment moved forward regardless of anything happening in our marriage. Eli had been left, unsupervised, in a locked vehicle for 2 hours and 41 minutes on a 91-degree day, and no amount of remorse in a kitchen changed the facts a prosecutor had already built a case around. My attorney, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Carla Reyes whom Marcus had recommended, told me plainly what the evidence meant for custody. It meant I had a clear, documented path to sole custody, and she intended to pursue it without apology. I sat in that first hearing and watched Taylor, thinner than she'd been 9 days earlier, answer a judge's questions in a voice that had lost all its usual color. Her attorney argued for supervised visitation pending the criminal case's resolution. Mine argued for exactly that, and the judge granted it without much deliberation, and I remember feeling, in that moment, something I hadn't expected to feel yet. Not triumph, nothing that clean, but a kind of grim, steady clarity, the sense of a man finally standing on solid ground after 9 days of walking on something that kept shifting under him. The fear started almost immediately, and it never really left after that. I was terrified constantly, of you finding my phone, of Denise noticing the hotel charges, of Renee slipping up on the phone, of Eli saying something innocent that would put it together for you before I was ready. I started rehearsing lies in the shower. I want you to know how ashamed I am of that specific detail, that I stood in our bathroom, some mornings, practicing what I'd say if you asked me a certain question, the way you'd practice for a job interview. I became a person who rehearsed lies to her own husband in the shower, and I don't think I'll ever stop being disgusted with that version of myself. The shame got physical, toward the end. I couldn't look at Eli's drawings on the fridge some mornings, that stupid one he made of our family, the 3 stick figures holding hands. I'd stand there with my coffee and have to look somewhere else in the kitchen because I couldn't hold both things in my head at once, him and what I was doing. I stopped sleeping. I lost weight I didn't mean to lose. I told myself, every single week from about April onward, that this was the week I'd end it. And every week I found a reason it had to be one more week. A deadline, a fight with Nathan about his own guilt, some small crisis that felt, in the moment, more urgent than doing the hard thing. The day it happened, the day with Eli in the car, I want you to know that wasn't a plan. I wasn't careless with him because I didn't care. I told myself 20 minutes, in and out, just enough time to finally tell Nathan it was over, in person, because I couldn't keep doing this to any of us anymore. And I got in that office, and it turned into an argument, and the argument turned into 2 hours because neither of us could just let it end clean, and the whole time some small voice in the back of my head was screaming at me to check on Eli. And I kept telling myself, just 5 more minutes, just let me finish this. And I need you to know that no punishment anyone gives me will ever be worse than the 2 hours and 41 minutes I've spent replaying what could have happened to him while I sat in that office finishing a fight, instead of being his mother. I tried to stop it 3 separate times before that day. I never told you that. Each time, I made it about a week before I found a reason to go back. I don't say that to make it sound complicated or sympathetic. I say it because it's true, and you asked for the truth, and I think the truest thing I can tell you is that I knew, every single time, that I was choosing it. Nobody made me. I chose it, over and over, for 6 months, and then I put our son in danger because I was too much of a coward to end it the easy way, months earlier, before it ever got to a parking lot. She stopped there. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Something in me had gone very quiet, not the numbness of the last 13 days, but something calmer and more final, the specific stillness of a man who has finally heard the last thing he needed to hear. "Thank you for telling me the truth," I said. "All of it, finally." I stood up from the table. It doesn't change what happens next. It didn't. The criminal case concluded 8 weeks later. Taylor pleaded to a lesser child endangerment charge, avoiding jail time but accepting probation, mandatory parenting classes, and a permanent record that would follow her for the rest of her life. The divorce moved faster than either attorney predicted. Carla Reyes built the custody case around the documented timeline, and Taylor's own attorney advised her, given everything on record, not to contest sole custody. I kept the house. I kept Eli. Taylor was granted supervised visitation 2 hours a week in a community center 12 minutes from where she now rents a 1-bedroom apartment across town. Nathan Brooks lost more than I expected him to. His wife filed for divorce within a week of the detective's call, and Ridgeline Creative quietly let him go 3 months later, once the story had made its way, as these things do, through enough of the office that Denise could no longer pretend not to know. I heard, secondhand, that he moved to Cleveland. I don't think about him much. He was never really the point. Eli is doing better than I had any right to hope, most days. He still sleeps with the one-legged dinosaur, glue holding at the seam. He asks about his mother sometimes, and I answer honestly, in language a 5-year-old can hold, that mommy made a very serious mistake, that she loves him, that grown-ups sometimes have to live apart because of choices they made. He accepts it, the way kids accept most things adults tell them, with more grace than the adults probably deserve. I braced myself, in those first weeks, for years of feeling exactly the way I felt sitting in that kitchen listening to her monologue. Instead, something quieter arrived, and it arrived early, and it surprised me. I started sleeping through the night again within a month. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd done that. I recognized myself again, somewhere along the way, in a version I liked better than the man who used to explain away every warning sign because the truth cost more than he was ready to pay. I'd become someone steadier than I was before any of this happened. Quieter, less willing to file away a stone in his stomach and call it nothing. There's a thought I want to leave you with, something I keep coming back to. Somewhere in those 9 days, Taylor's mother told me, in a courthouse hallway, that her daughter had gotten lost somewhere and didn't know how she'd ended up so far from herself. I think that's true. I also think getting lost doesn't happen to you. You make 100 small turns, one at a time, and each one feels survivable in the moment. The only real question is whether you turn back before the road runs out, or whether someone else has to find you standing in the wreckage of it. That's my story. A locked car, a superglued dinosaur, a hallway conversation I never asked for. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. If any part of this felt familiar, tell me in the comments. I read every one, and I'd genuinely love to hear your own story too. See you in the next one. What's hardest to sit with isn't Taylor's betrayal itself. It's how ordinary the road to it was. Nobody in this story wakes up one day and decides to become someone capable of leaving a child in a locked car. Taylor became that person through 100 small negotiations with herself, each one small enough to survive scrutiny on its own. That's the part that should unsettle any listener more than the affair itself. Catastrophic outcomes rarely announce themselves in advance. They accumulate in decisions too small to notice until the sum of them becomes undeniable. James's arc matters here too, in a different register. His instinct throughout was to trust the schedule, to treat a marriage like a logistics problem where things generally arrive where they're supposed to. That instinct served him well professionally and failed him personally, because people, unlike shipments, can be quietly rerouting themselves for months before anyone notices the discrepancy. His growth isn't really about becoming suspicious. It's about learning that attentiveness and trust aren't opposites, and that noticing a stone in your stomach is information, not disloyalty. The custody outcome, in the end, wasn't really about punishment. Carla Reyes never framed it that way, and neither did the judge. It was about documented risk, plainly recorded. That distinction matters, because it reframes what winning meant here. James didn't win a war against Taylor. He simply had the facts on his side when it counted, which is a very different, quieter kind of vindication than the story might have promised at its start. I keep thinking about that one detail. The search Taylor typed into a laptop 2 weeks before anyone confronted her. How to tell if your husband suspects. Not, how do I stop? Not, am I about to ruin everything? Just a woman managing a risk, the way you'd manage a leak before it floods the whole house. That's the detail that stays with me longer than anything else in this story. I don't think most people who end up somewhere like Taylor did set out to become someone capable of it. I think they just keep choosing the smaller lie over the harder conversation, week after week, until the debt comes due all at once. Maybe that's worth sitting with in your own life, not out of suspicion toward the people you love, but out of honesty with yourself about which conversations you've been quietly postponing.